I was very pleased when I was approached to be part of the, I suppose, the social dialogue grouping on innovations around crime prevention. But when I was asked to give some kind of an abstract that I could work with, I had no idea what kind of innovation stuff I could come up with that wasn't either so off the wall that it would be thrown off, or was so commonplace that it wasn't innovative. So I went literally off the wall, and I didn't really think it would be accepted, but it was. And what I did, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is I literally thought about how problematic walls, both physical and metaphysical, are in our formulations around dealing with crime, and how that needs to be something we need to think about very creatively and thoughtfully about. And so I started this little kind of conversation with groups of people who I thought may also find walls to be problematic, again, both metaphysical, but predominantly physical. And one of the persons that I started this conversation with was somebody called Chris Overall, who's a police officer with the Durban Metro Police. And we both were very perturbed by walls. And the reasons for that are there. I'm not going to talk very much about that. But I suppose what became clearer and clearer to us is that what South Africans have tended to do is to create walls to try to protect themselves, and yet what we weren't sure of was whether those walls actually are having the purpose that they are intended to have. And if we are the second highest murder capital in the world, then something is not going right with the way that we're understanding the spaces in which we live. We chose to look at the suburban space within cities because, as we've put it, they are spaces of aspiration. They're places where people want to be, where they want to get out of the inner city, or they want to get out of townships, they want to get into suburbs. But suburbs have come to look very peculiar. And we all know the suburbs that those of us who in South Africa live in are very walled spaces. And yet what we don't know is whether those walls actually serve the purpose that they were meant for. Chris and I together suspected that they didn't, but we wanted to test this out. And we thought that we would do this in two ways. The one was by comparing two very different suburbs. One, which is a pretty unwalled suburb, which is an area called Umbilo, which is in the south of Durban and is a fairly working to lower middle class area. And the other is a fairly affluent area called Westville, which is a very walled suburb. And those people who know Durban will be familiar with both of those suburbs. But most importantly, we wanted to understand what the people who do policing think about walls, because they are the people that understand this best. In other words, to place not only agency, but also knowledge bearing on people that we often overlook as experts, and those are both people from the private and the public police. So over a period of time, I did what I tend to like best, which is to ride along with cops, going to various houses and homes when crimes occurred, to find out which were the houses that were being targeted, and to also have conversations with both public and private police about where incidences were occurring most. And I did this together with Chris, so we looked at incidence reports, we did drive-alongs, we did a photographic journey, and we also then went along and had public deliberations. Now, GIZ would be very happy to know that there are practical implications of the study, which I'll discuss in a minute, which of course we would love to be supported on. Okay. We decided to I wanted to just present two very different photos. We are on your website, by the way, but we're not yet supported in any other way. Okay, so I wanted to present two very different images. The one is of an unwalled house in Umbilo, the first area. And so while we were with the private security police officers or whatever you want to call them, we spoke to them about this house. You can't actually see the sign, but they are served by one of the private security industry companies. We've tried to block that. And we went with the provider, and we said, have you ever been called to this house? And he said, no, this is not a house that we are concerned about. And eventually, myself and Chris just simply walked up those stairs, knocked on the door, and the woman who lives in the house opened the door, and we said, can we just ask you a couple of questions? And she said, sure. And we said, how long have you lived in this house for? And she said, 30 years. And we said, well, do you want to build a wall? And she said, well, why would I do something as stupid as that? And we were like, no, we were just curious to know. And we were like, have you ever experienced any sort of crime? And she said, well, I've had a cell phone stolen. So we were, okay, well, that doesn't seem to be very problematic. But she had at her core this understanding that the way that her house looked, and she does have a husband and a child, was a defensible space for a number of reasons, which I'll discuss in a minute. But this is fairly typical of a house in that area, although most houses have walls that would come to either a waist sort of level on me, and because it's me, that's not very high. But otherwise, they would have palisade fencing, which you could see through. Okay, so that's an idea of that house. That compared with a typical Westville house, which has usually a solid wall and also has that gate which you can't see through either. There's really no connection between street and neighborhood. And of course, that does exactly the opposite of the Umbilo house. It actually breaks any form of natural surveillance. Nobody can see in, nobody can see out. And so we continued our little journey, and the police were saying to us that it was in this area that they were most worried about one particular form of crime, and that's violent organized crime. Right, and I'll talk about two different crimes in a minute. What we realized then through this experiment that we did, which took a couple of months, I'm not actually talking to these slides, I know, but don't worry about it, is that there's a very tenuous link between walls and security. There is no clear link that if you have a wall, you are going to be safe. In fact, what we found in our drive-alongs and in our discussions with the police and the private security industry and in our looking at crime incidences is that actually, if you have a high solid wall, the possibility for violent organized crime is far higher than in areas where there are low or no walls, which will not have no crime. They will have crimes, but it will be opportunistic petty crimes. So very, very different. So you make your choice, basically, about which crime you would prefer. Now, of course, this all talks very well to the septet sort of grouping of criminologists who believe in this idea of crime prevention through environmental design. And we've brought on septet scholars into this particular study. The policing perspective on walls across the board is that walls are basically a policing nightmare. And I will leave these slides. People can find out why. It's also been published in the Stability Journal. And every single person that we spoke to at a high level, both within the public and the private security agencies, do not have solid walls around their house at all. They know that this is a security risk. And so we found this interesting, and I want to show you, okay, I'll show you a picture later on. So we thought, okay, what then are the sort of good design principles that would enhance security and that people need to start deliberating around? And for us, you need to design for natural surveillance, both inward and outward. You need to design for social integration and interaction so that the walls, both literal and figurative, fall down. And we need to have technological innovations that can replace high walls. And this is where the private security company came on board. And very interestingly, the private security companies, the minute we mentioned this to them, they are in. Not only have they provided financial support for this project, but they have also provided access to any information that we want from them. They are fully on board, particularly two companies, and the one is a Durban-based one called Blue Security, and the other one is called ADT, which we all know about. It's a multinational company. This very quickly is a photograph of one of the senior police officers in this area, Umbilo. He wanted us to go and see his house because he explained that when he moved from an area called Sydenham, which is a so-called coloured area in Durban, into this area called Glenwood, which is right next to Umbilo, the first thing he did is he broke down his wall and met his neighbours. And he explained the logic behind it, and he wanted us to take this photo to show people what he thought a very good way of using boundary structures is. The only reason he has a fence, in his understanding, is to keep dogs and children inside. That is the purpose for fences. Right. So imagining forward, what do we want to do? And I'll try and stop there so that I don't go over my time. Is for us, this research is interesting because it involves multiple actors, but we didn't want to stop just at the research level. We wanted to take it forward, to take it into the public imagination, to get people talking about wars. Some of you may have heard, we've had numerous, I can't even tell you, probably about 10 different radio stations have profiled this particular research, including Cape Talk, SAFM, Radio Lotus, Limpopo Radio, and so on and so forth. Those of you who've seen this, it's hit the front page of a number of newspapers with people really being interested in this. It's actually also hit the news in the Atlantic Times in the US. So it's the public imagination, and we have these sort of public discussions about this in various parts of Durban and now in Cape Town. But also, what we wanted to do was to involve local government, and this is my point really, Betty, that I was talking about later, to say, let's do something innovative. Let's find a space, say for cities who are here today somewhere, I saw Martin, where we actually choose an area that is high-walled but also high crime. We invest by breaking down the walls, putting up other forms of boundaries, and seeing what happens. If it works, we roll it out. If it doesn't, the city takes responsibility for building up. We're in discussion with the city about this. But another very interesting thing has happened in the meantime. At the meeting was a group called Alliance Française. People will know about the Alliance Française. And the Alliance Française came up to us and said, listen, we really want to be part of this project. We are going to break down our wall. They are currently in a very affluent area in Durban, and we are in the process of breaking down the wall of the Alliance Française. And you can go onto the Alliance Française Durban, and you'll find a site which is called Alliance Without Walls. And this is all being done as an experiment involving multi-sectoral groupings, including sex workers who work in the park across the road from the Alliance Française, the private security companies, particularly Blue Security, the police, both SAPS and Metro Police, the community that surrounds, and a group of architects called Dalla Architects, the CSIR, because they were involved in breaking down the wall of the Goethe Institute in Johannesburg for very different reasons, because it was to coincide with the breaking down of the Berlin Wall, and DUT, which is myself. And so a very interesting grouping getting together to do something very symbolic in Durban. And this is the first, and you can see the objectives are the objectives of the Alliance Française. Why is the Alliance Française doing this with us? One, because they want to increase their visibility, because they understand that visibility and safety are closely interwoven. They want to become a space of cohesion where people can see them off the street and feel part of that organization, not a part from it. They also believe that it will create greater safety through activating a more public space. They want to contribute to new models of urban safety and design, which is something that we're trying to really engage in Durban. So the other group that's not there is the architecture department at DUT, where the students are involved in designing what is going to replace the current wall around Alliance Française. You can see the wall over there. There's a person there called Dung Jaganya. He's an architect. He is actually working with the architecture students outside the wall of the Alliance Française, trying to get that design thing going. That is the logo of Alliance Without Walls, which is the Alliance Francaise design. And the last photo on the end is very funny, and I'll end there because it's very symbolic, and I don't know what it will mean to those of you who have these strange ideas about other beings and greater forces. But we had a meeting with all community and other actors at 4 o'clock one afternoon at the Alliance Francaise. And at 4 o'clock, that white car drove into the wall of the Alliance Francaise and broke down a huge section which is now lying on the floor. And the Mercedes-Benz, by the way, that drove into the wall was completely untouched, and so was the driver. And so that for us was the very beginning of the breaking down of the Alliance Francaise wall. So I'm going to stop there. It's an imagination, it's moving forward, it's trying to get people to think differently, and it does have a scientific basis if you look at the CPTD literature. I'll stop over there.